All right. So hi, everyone. My name is Nadja Popovich. Can you hear me? Okay. So I'm a graphics editor on the New York Times climate team, and that means that I make charts and maps and graphs, and I report using data, all on the topic of climate change. And my goal as a journalist is to translate this often very complex topic, the science and the policy implications, for as broad an audience as I can. Thanks so much for having me here. It's my first Tapestry conference. And I'd like to spend the next 15-ish minutes talking about a project that I did earlier this year with some of my colleagues from the New York Times graphics department. So it's called How Much Hotter Is Your Hometown Than When You Were Born? And I'm going to go through it in more detail in a little bit. But first, I just want to give a little bit of background because, as someone who spends the majority of their time reporting on climate change and visualizing climate data, I recognize that it can sometimes be a little bit abstract for our audience. I think for many people, climate can feel very far away in both time and space. That actually might be a little bit less true here in Miami than in other places, but broadly speaking. So I wanted to start with, this is actually one of the first graphics that I made when I started this job at the New York Times. And it uses data from the Yale Center for Climate Change Communication, which has been polling Americans for a very long time on what they think about climate change. And in the map on your left, you can see that a majority of Americans in most counties across the country think that global warming will harm people in the US. But on the right, you see that way fewer people say that global warming will harm them personally. And I think these maps really show how even people who think climate change will have big impacts on the planet and on people, kind of don't think those impacts are always so personal. They don't think it'll impact them directly or personally. And instead, I think climate change often feels like something that happens to other people. It happens to future generations, or it happens to people far away in the Arctic or in low-lying island nations, but not to me in Washington, D.C., or New York, or Topeka, or wherever you might be located. So this year, a big goal of mine was to figure out how we could bring some of these effects of climate change a little bit closer to home for our audience. And so I sat down with some colleagues to brainstorm how we could do that. And our first goal was pretty basic. We wanted to localize geographically. So the most common data set in climate is really talking about global warming, right? So this is a graphic that I made earlier this year, showing that 2017 was declared by NASA to be the second warmest year on record. Specifically, it shows how much the world has warmed on average compared to a baseline. In this case, the baseline is, I think, 1880 to 1899, so roughly a time before humans started emitting the vast majority of greenhouse gases from industry and other sources. And you can see the upward march of these what are called temperature anomalies, so the difference compared to that baseline over time. So, like I said, this is a pretty ubiquitous data set. It's been visualized in lots of different ways. All of these show you essentially the same thing, which is that the world has warmed up over the past century. Most of them give you a broad global trend. There's a couple on this slide that give a little bit more geographic specificity. So down here, the starburst actually shows by country breakdown in temperature anomalies. Up there, you have this map that gives you a little bit more of a sense of the geographic pattern of warming, right? But broadly, these are looking at still this global picture. And what we wanted to do in this piece was really zoom in more locally. And we knew that we could do this in part because we have geographically specific data on temperature going back many decades. This map up here is from NASA for 2017. It again shows temperature anomalies. So in this case, how much warmer or cooler each location on Earth was compared to a baseline average. And then this kind of data exists for the future too, so in projections of the future. This graphic is from the 5th assessment report of the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, and it shows future projections for surface air temperature by 2100 from a series of models. So we knew we could show people kind of some more specificity in location for historical trends, and then we knew that we could show them how that could change in the future as well. But we didn't just want to zoom people into a map, right? We also wanted to contextualize the time frame in a more personal way. So as I mentioned earlier, we often talk about how the world has warmed from some base period or since pre-industrial times. And then models also project warming out to some future period, very often 2100. Here again is the same idea. This is looking at how much hotter it could get by 2100 in the United States. But I think for many people, 2100 feels quite far away. It maybe doesn't have that much meaning. It's not currently within our lifetime, within most of our lifetimes. So for this project, we thought it would be really interesting to instead focus in on people's lifetimes, since we're talking about personalization. And then our third goal really was to make temperature change a little bit more tangible. We really thought what metric to show people. We had already decided we would focus in on temperature specifically, because that's a scientifically pretty straightforward and well understood climate metric. But the usual framing is the average global temperature change. And I think that that can be hard for some people to directly relate to, because I think in part, a degree or two warming in your everyday lives, right? When you go outside and you experience the weather, doesn't really feel like that much, but it's quite different on climate scales. And so since this was going to be a project talking about personalization, we thought through what else could we show people? And we ended up taking inspiration from a piece that I did actually the year before with my colleague Brad Plumer. This piece was based on an analysis by a group called Climate Impact Lab. And instead of looking at this average global temperature or average annual temperature per location, they counted the number of extremely hot days in each location and showed how that could change over time. And they defined extremely hot here as 95 degrees Fahrenheit. And I really liked this metric because it just felt a little more visceral, right? All of us have experienced a 95-degree day. We know what that feels like. It's that kind of uncomfortably hot day. It's the kind of day where maybe you want to stay inside in the AC instead of going out. And then also I think that this is a really important metric because it's at these extremes. It's with the extreme heat that we're going to see the biggest impacts of climate change, not necessarily at the average. So we got back in touch with the folks at Climate Impact Lab to ask if they would be interested in undertaking a similar analysis, but in greater detail for this project, and they said yes. So I now want to take you through that project. So this is the project, and when you arrive on the home screen, we ask you to enter some information, your hometown and your year of birth. So here I'm going to put in Miami. I'll just put it in 1970. And we take you through this three-step progression. First, we show you when you were born, how many of these very hot days, so in our project here, we actually define those as 90-degree days, how many you could expect that year. And here for that year, so for 1970, what we're actually showing isn't exactly how many 90-degree days there were that year. We're showing a 21-year rolling average because, again, we're talking about climate here, not necessarily the year-to-year variations in weather. So if you were born on an anomalously hot year, we wanted to make sure that you didn't get a different message here. Instead, we want to really focus in on climate. So here it says, 84 days could be expected then in 1970. And as you scroll, we show you the historical change. So today, Miami can expect 133 days at or above 90 degrees per year on average. And then step 3 gives you kind of a reveal of the future. So this is based on a climate model, and it shows you that there could be as many as 100, or there could be about 150 of these very hot days. And we give you a likely range because obviously there's uncertainty in projecting out into the future. But it gives you this idea of how things have changed in your lifetime and how they could change also in your lifetime. We used age 80 as kind of the definition of lifetime because that's average life expectancy in the US, I think is 79 years right now, so we just rounded up. And then there's some text explaining a little bit more detail what you've seen here. So the model that we're using actually is based on a scenario that is kind of optimistic. This scenario assumes that the world will meet roughly Paris Agreement goals, but if we don't do that, it could actually end up even hotter than what we're showing you here. And then as you scroll down, we also zoom people out. So after we've presented this very personal view, we also show you what's going on around the rest of the world. You know, this is a global problem, and so we really want to make sure that that is addressed. Here we take you back to Miami, give you a little bit of background information reminding you of what's going on there before we take you to other regions like the tropics, which are going to see some of the largest increases in very hot days. Here we take you to New Delhi, India, which is home to 22 million people. And it could go from just under 6 months of 90-degree days to up to 8 months of 90-degree days by the end of the century. But even, you know, more moderate regions, so here we take you back to Europe, could see some of the largest relative increases in these very hot days. And I think, I think what we're trying to do here is really give people two views. So the top here, we give them something that I would call like the near view, and further down we give them what would be called the far view. And I first read about this idea of the near and the far view in ProPublica's really great guide to building news applications. And usually in the news, the way we start these kinds of data stories is by showing you the far view first. So we first show you a zoomed out view, like the nation or the world. You very often see this with climate data as well, and we show you broad patterns before maybe picking a couple of places that we will show you a near view of. Maybe we show you Miami and DC and a couple of other places, how things are going to change there. Or maybe later, further down the story, we let you explore, enter your own information. But in this piece, what we really wanted to experiment with was starting with that really personal view. So providing personalization as like a reason people would want to look at this. We ask you to put in a little bit of information about yourself. And that, I think, gives people a certain kind of stake in the results. Once we've asked you to proactively put in information, then we also obviously want to provide you with some kind of payoff. And in this case, the payoff is that you learn something new and you see this climate data in a way that you wouldn't have otherwise seen it. Of course, then further down, again, we wanted to zoom people back out to that far view and provide that broader context and let them see the patterns globally. And, you know, I think that this is also something that really takes advantage of like the unique strengths of online storytelling. Like this kind of story is just not something you would ever have been able to do in print or other static media. And, you know, the one thing about it is that it is kind of hard. It takes a lot of thought and a lot of development effort to do this kind of piece. But I think when it is done right, it can really provide something like exceptionally powerful for the users and something exceptionally engaging. And yeah, that's all I have today. Thank you so much for listening.